Hey guys, tonight's descent walks the blade between sanctity and savagery. We're not here to mythologize history. We're here to exhume it. This isn't the tale engraved on marble plaques or recited in award ceremonies. It's the story carved in flesh, silenced by fear, and stitched into the seams of our present. Queen Isabella I of Castile is often draped in divine titles. The Catholic monarch, Mother of Spain, Saint of the Reconquista. But beneath the velvet robes and stained glass windows lies another legacy, one of erasure, empire, and engineered obedience. She didn't merely react to the tides of her time. She redirected them. She codified cruelty into policy. She made faith a mechanism of control. And she turned exploration into annihilation. Under her crown, the Guanche were wiped from their islands. Under her crown, inquisitors branded bodies with flame. Under her crown, entire civilizations were enslaved, uprooted, or vanished. But you won't find that in your textbooks. What you'll find are euphemisms, unifier, visionary, patron of discovery. But what if that discovery was the systematic conquest of memory itself? What if sainthood was just empire in disguise? That's the story we're telling tonight. And it's not just medieval dust. It's modern scaffolding. The systems Isabella birthed, surveillance, censorship, state religion, racial hierarchy, still whisper through today's laws and borders. And tonight we'll dig into the story you weren't taught in history class. So before we step into the chamber of shadows, dim the lights, wrap yourself in a warm blanket. And if these hidden histories speak to something deep within you, tap that like button and subscribe for the stories they don't want remembered. Your support doesn't just keep this channel alive, it keeps the silence from winning, because the past isn't dead. It's archived, and sometimes it's still screaming. Let's listen. What if the age of conquest began not with the clash of continents, but with the quiet erasure of an island people? Before the ships of Columbus carved paths across the Atlantic, a different archipelago became the testing ground for Europe's appetite for domination. The Canary Islands, lush, volcanic, and inhabited by the Guanche, lay in the crosshairs of Castilian ambition. Though the initial incursions began in the early 15th century, it was under Queen Isabella's reign that the so-called pacification transformed into extermination. The Guanche were not warriors of empire, but pastoralists and poets of the hills, their language and matrilineal customs echoing with spiritual intimacy. To Castile, they were not human, they were an obstacle. The conquest escalated not as a campaign of defense, but as an experiment in methodical cruelty. Entire villages were burned with their inhabitants still inside. Captured children were chained and auctioned in Iberian ports before their cries had even been translated. Women were especially targeted, not just for labor, but for forced breeding and concubinage. Priests spoke of salvation while soldiers dragged the sacred from homes and turned altars into auction blocks. This wasn't just warfare, it was a dress rehearsal for genocide. Castilian cartographers drew maps not to explore but to partition and possess. The Guanche weren't merely conquered, they were dehumanized, then disappeared. One chronicler described how Guanche mothers smothered their infants before surrender, believing death was more merciful than Spanish mercy. Entire bloodlines were obliterated in a single generation. By the time Isabella's forces declared the archipelago tamed, less than a quarter of the original population remained. Those who lived did so in servitude, their names stripped, their gods outlawed, their voices silenced. The Canary campaign became a prototype. The bureaucrats who managed deportations there would later manage plantations in the Caribbean. The theology that justified slaughter in Tenerife would echo in sermons across Hispaniola, and the logistics, routes, ships, auction houses, propaganda would soon be scaled for transatlantic horror. The Guanche became the first ghosts of empire. Their disappearance wasn't an accident, it was a feature. The empire had learned that to erase a people, one must erase the memory of their suffering. And so textbooks would speak of pacification and civilization, not rape and incineration. Here's what they don't want you to know. The very same queen who is sainted in bronze oversaw this cleansing. Isabella did not flinch. In court records, she praised the captains who returned with shackled islanders. In royal charters, she rewarded those who displaced entire villages with land and title. The church, meanwhile, baptized the bloodbath as divine triumph. But wait, it gets worse. Those who questioned the morality of the slaughter were not heeded. A few friars documented the suffering, but their accounts were buried, ignored, or rebranded as tales of martyrdom. The silence around the Guanche was strategic. If Europe admitted what happened, how could it justify what was coming? Better to bury the bones beneath cathedrals and claim providence. Better to call slavery salvation and genocide governance. In this, Isabella set the precedent, not just for conquest, but for concealment. The Canary Islands were not the start of her empire, they were the forge. Here, the weapons were tested, not swords, but language, faith, law. Here, Isabella learned that when murder is draped in robes and rituals, few dare call it what it is. And so it continued. The blueprints etched in island blood were carried aboard caravels to the so-called New World. The tactics, divide, deceive, dominate, were repeated with frightening precision. And the victims, whether islanders, highland villagers, or forest dwellers, were all erased by the same hand. This is where the story turns, because what we call the Age of Discovery was, in truth, the Age of Disappearance. And Queen Isabella, so often painted in gold leaf and glory, was its high priestess. The Guanche were the first to fall, but not the last. Their songs are no longer sung. Their names do not appear in the pages of children's textbooks. Their gods have no temples, and yet their blood stains the pillars of empire. What if history began not with a beginning, but with a burial? What if our monuments are built on misremembering? The Guanche teach us that extinction is not just biological. It is cultural, spiritual, linguistic. It is erasure masquerading as progress. And it began not in faraway lands, but on islands just off Europe's shore, where the cross met the crown, and the people beneath both were crushed. So the next time you hear of Isabella as the Catholic monarch, remember this. Before she baptized continents, she baptized extermination. Before she funded voyages, she funded disappearances. Before Columbus sailed west, the Guanche vanished east, into chains, silence, and sanctioned oblivion. Not all genocides begin with gunpowder. Some begin with parchment and prayer. Some begin when truth is traded for triumph. And some begin with a queen whose sainthood shields her sins. The story of the Guanche is not over. It lingers in the silence, in the ruins, in the questions still not asked. Because history has a habit of forgetting what it fears. And in the Canary Islands, it learned to forget early. The empire began with ash, and the ash was Guanche. What if the most feared court in Europe wasn't held in the name of justice, but in the name of control? In 1478, with papal approval and Isabella's unwavering support, a new institution was born, the Spanish Inquisition. Its purpose was never truly spiritual. Beneath the incense and Latin liturgy lay a brutal machinery engineered for political consolidation. At its helm was Tomás de Torquemada, a name that would come to symbolize not faith, but fanaticism. He was not a judge. He was an architect of terror. Under his guidance, the Inquisition metastasized from a legal tribunal into a nationwide surveillance apparatus. No town was too small, no family too insignificant. The eyes of the Inquisition were everywhere. Neighbors, merchants, even children were enlisted as informants. Over 400,000 individuals were investigated in its first decades. They were accused not only of doctrinal deviation, but of dietary habits, whispered prayers, unfamiliar rituals, and most damningly, of clinging to other religious beliefs beneath the guise of conformity. Those suspected were seized in silence, often in the dead of night. Homes were ransacked, children left sobbing, spouses separated by dungeon walls. The accused were denied knowledge of their accusers or the evidence. Torture was not an aberration, it was protocol. The rack, the strappado, the brazier, all sanctioned, all sacred, and from broken bodies came broken confessions. These were then read aloud in public spectacles called autos da fe. Cloaked as ceremonies of penance, they were pageants of power. The condemned were paraded before crowds, shamed, sentenced, sometimes burned alive, all under banners proclaiming the mercy of God. Property was seized, not just as punishment, but as a source of royal enrichment. Isabella's crown swelled with confiscated wealth. Whole neighborhoods were gutted, their assets redistributed to loyalists, and still Isabella was celebrated as a paragon of piety. But here's the truly disturbing part. The Inquisition's reach extended beyond the flesh. It targeted memory, culture, language. Sacred texts were burned. Burial customs were outlawed. Naming conventions were replaced with imposed Christian alternatives. This was not conversion, it was obliteration, and it was systematic. The Inquisition kept meticulous records, scrolls, ledgers, interrogatory transcripts, archives of agony, bound and filed. And yet, history classrooms reduce this to a footnote. They speak of it as an unfortunate excess of religious zeal, but it was neither excess nor religious. It was policy, and it served a clear function: unify Spain under a single authority by erasing all deviation. The church was weaponized. The law was re-engineered. And the populace was conditioned to fear not sin, but suspicion. Children learned to confess their parents' habits. Friends avoided each other's eyes in public. Paranoia became patriotism, and silence became survival. The Inquisition was not a moment in time. It was an atmosphere, and it lingered for centuries. Even those who escaped its torture bore its scars. Generations learned to whisper, to hide, to self-censor. Creativity was strangled, dissent unthinkable. And in its wake, a nation of watchers emerged, each citizen a potential informant. The Inquisition didn't just destroy lives, it reshaped society. It institutionalized cruelty under the guise of order, and it made Queen Isabella not merely a monarch, but a myth. A woman who could bless oppression and be called holy, who could fund a fear machine and still be praised for unity. But what if unity built on torment is no unity at all? What if sanctity cloaked in blood is no sanctity? Here's what isn't taught in school. The Inquisition wasn't an anomaly. It was the logical outcome of empire by force. And Isabella, in her sanctified silence, sanctioned it all. She gave Torquemada his charter. She funded the tribunals. She reaped the rewards. And she died, believing she had served God. But the God she served, history must ask, was he the God of truth or the God of fear? The Inquisition turned salvation into a snare, and it did so under the eyes of a queen who remains untarnished in statues and stories. Yet behind every martyr's scream, behind every burnt parchment, behind every missing family, stands her shadow. The tribunal of fear was her creation, not a relic of superstition, but a blueprint of suppression. And its echoes are still with us. whenever dissent is demonized, whenever belief is policed, because when cruelty wears a crown, it doesn't retire. What if the most celebrated unification in European history was born not of triumph, but of betrayal? In 1492, the last Muslim-ruled territory in Iberia, the Emirate of Granada, fell to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. The moment was painted as divine destiny, a cross planted where a crescent had ruled for centuries. But beneath the spectacle of banners and pageantry, there was a parchment, a treaty. Its clauses were clear: the protection of local rights, religious practices, and civil customs. Isabella herself swore to honor it. It was not just a gesture, it was a vow before God and nation. But that promise dissolved almost as soon as the ink dried. Within months, mosques were shuttered or converted to churches. Imams and community elders were exiled, imprisoned, or simply disappeared. The right to practice other religious beliefs, once guaranteed, was now a crime. Baptism became a matter of survival, not salvation. Entire neighborhoods were forced to convert in mass public rituals, swords drawn in the background. This wasn't assimilation. It was subjugation masquerading as unity. When resistance stirred, it was labeled treason. Armed revolt wasn't required to be called a rebel. Praying in one's native tongue could be enough. The crown responded not with reconciliation, but with military reprisal. Families were slaughtered in the name of peace. Lands were seized under the justification of breach of treaty. The same treaty the crown had already desecrated. And here's the dark truth. This wasn't a breach of faith. It was a tactic. The Treaty of Granada was never meant to last. It was a trap, a paper prison, until the walls of real prisons could be built. And Isabella, far from being duped, was its designer. She understood that conquest by sword must be followed by conquest of conscience. Her vision for Spain did not include pluralism. It demanded uniformity of language, belief, and allegiance. And those who could not or would not conform were simply erased. This wasn't the conclusion of a war, it was the opening act of a purge. By 1499, a campaign of forced baptisms began in earnest. The methods grew crueler: book burnings, imprisonment, family separations. Laws were passed, barring the use of traditional garments or languages. Identity itself was criminalized. And when uprisings broke out in the Alpujarras Mountains, they were crushed with biblical fury. Entire villages were razed. Survivors were relocated, dispersed to break communal bonds. This was social engineering with a sword, and it had precedent because the same methods had worked in the Canary Islands. The empire was now applying its island experiments to the mainland. Granada was no longer just a city, it was a template. But here's what isn't taught in school. The betrayal of the treaty wasn't a side effect of conquest. It was conquest itself, refined into legal strategy. Isabella didn't just break her promise. She proved that promises were tools, not truths. And when used skillfully, they became weapons. The Catholic monarchs weren't just wielders of swords. They were wielders of clauses and conditions, signing with one hand and striking with the other. Today, Granada is romanticized in tourist guides and palace tours. The Alhambra still stands, ornate, majestic, a jewel of Andalusian artistry. But the people who built it? Silenced. Their descendants? Assimilated, expelled, or extinguished. The Treaty of Granada is rarely quoted today. But it remains a chilling document, not for its promises, but for its precision. It shows how power cloaks its cruelty in legality, how faith can be used not as refuge, but as requirement, and how a queen canonized for her virtue orchestrated one of history's most calculated betrayals. Isabella's oath to the people of Granada was never meant to be kept. It was a scaffold, meant to hold them still long enough to shackle them. The Inquisition would follow, the expulsion would come, and the template set in Granada would travel across oceans into new continents, cloaked in crosses and crowns. This is where the story turns, because conquest as Isabella practiced it was never just military. It was psychological, legal, spiritual, and in this fusion, treaties became traps. Not all betrayals are written in blood. Some are written in ink, on fine parchment, with royal seals pressed into wax. And history, taught by the victors, often calls them peace. But peace built on erasure is not peace. It is compliance. It is memory, edited and redacted. And Queen Isabella, for all her sanctified legacy, remains the editor-in-chief. The fall of Granada was not the end of coexistence. It was the beginning of conformity through fear. And from those silent ashes rose an empire that would carry this method to every shore it touched. When treaties become traps and promises become prisons, what remains of truth? Only the ruins. What if the most celebrated voyage in Western history wasn't a leap into the unknown, but a contract of calculated cruelty? In April 1492, just weeks after the final surrender of Granada, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand signed the Capitulaciones de Santa Fe. This document gave Christopher Columbus more than just permission, it gave him power, governorship over any lands he discovered. 10% of all wealth extracted, hereditary nobility for his lineage, and the full backing of the crown. Columbus didn't sail for curiosity, he sailed with a contract. A blueprint for extraction, subjugation, and sovereign enrichment. And at the heart of that blueprint stood Isabella. Legends claim she pawned her jewels to fund the voyage, but the truth is more bureaucratic and more deliberate. Funds were drawn from royal treasuries, bolstered by taxes on already displaced communities. This wasn't a desperate gamble, it was a state-sponsored expedition. The goal? Empire. But here's the disturbing part. The vision was already tainted before the first sail unfurled. Columbus spoke of converting souls, but counted bodies as commodities. His diaries betray the truth. He was cataloguing people as assets from day one. When he landed in what is now the Bahamas, he described the locals as generous, gentle, and spiritually receptive. But then came the line. They would make good servants. The crown agreed. Letters from court reveal that Isabella and Ferdinand saw the voyage as a pathway to territorial dominance and religious expansion. But underneath that holy rhetoric was cold calculation. The indigenous peoples were seen not as allies, but as inventory. And Columbus's reports were filled not with maps, but with measures. Gold veins, labor potential, and the ease of conquest. His second voyage returned not just with tales, but with captives. Shackled islanders paraded through Spanish ports. Some were gifted to nobles. Others sold at market. Their discovery was already a transaction. But what most don't realize is how institutional this became, how quickly the crown codified what began as pillage. The Requerimiento, a document drafted just years later, demanded native peoples submit to Spanish rule and the church, or face annihilation. It was read aloud, in Spanish, to people who couldn't understand it, and when they didn't comply, violence was deemed righteous. This was not exploration, it was exploitation under decree, and the Capitulaciones de Santa Fe were the prototype. Queen Isabella's signature didn't just launch ships, it launched a system that would evolve into the encomienda, forced labor in the guise of protection, a system that would spawn centuries of transatlantic slavery, a system that would crush entire civilizations beneath the weight of crosses and contracts. And all of it began with a royal pact, inked in a moment of celebration, destined for centuries of mourning. Columbus became the herald. But Isabella was the sponsor. She didn't witness the massacres to come, but she laid their foundation. She greenlit the logic that some peoples were expendable, that conquest could be sacred, that domination was divine entitlement. And here's what isn't taught in school. The same queen who expelled those of other religious faiths for purity also financed the export of that ideology abroad. The genocide wasn't a surprise, it was a sequel. The tactics perfected in Iberia now had new stage, and Columbus, contract in hand, was her emissary. Isabella's legacy is not a tale of discovery. It is a tale of deployment. Her reign was not marked by tolerance, but by transformation, of compassion into conquest, of faith into fear. And that voyage in 1492 was not a beginning. It was an extension of the same logic that burned books in Granada and tortured confessions in Seville. The New World wasn't new, it was next, and the apocalypse didn't fall from the sky. It came by sail, sealed in a royal pact. This is what they don't want you to see, that the age of exploration was never innocent. It was engineered, down to the line items in a contract. And Isabella, far from being a passive benefactor, was a central architect. The capitulaciones framed genocide as governance, and they were signed with the same flourish that expelled hundreds of thousands in Europe, because to Isabella, conquest was scalable. From Alhambra to the Antilles, from treaties to terra nullius, and her empire would not rest until every border bore her blueprint. What if the voyage we celebrate was not a crossing but a curse? What if the real discovery was not land, but how to legitimize annihilation? The apocalypse was financed with royal ink, and it sailed under the banner of a queen canonized in history. But no amount of sainthood can sanctify chains, and no amount of parchment can excuse the pain it unleashed. The ocean remembers, and beneath its waves lie the echoes of a pact, a contract not for discovery, but for domination. What if the first handshake between civilizations was actually a closed fist? When Columbus stepped ashore in 1492, he encountered the Taíno and Arawak peoples. These were communities of fishermen, farmers, artisans, rooted in ancestral land, rich in culture, and open in spirit. Their welcome was sincere, gifts, guidance, and trust offered without suspicion. Columbus described them as generous, curious, and docile. But his admiration was not for their humanity, it was for their vulnerability. They would make good servants, he wrote, a phrase that sealed their fate. First contact was not a meeting, it was a measure of what could be taken. And take he did. Within weeks, captives were seized. Ships that had arrived empty of gold returned with shackled bodies. These were not ambassadors, they were trophies. Isabella and Ferdinand received them with royal ceremony, and the reports they received were not warnings, they were invitations to expand. On Columbus's second voyage, the goal was clear: conquest. He arrived not as explorer, but as enforcer. With soldiers, dogs, and steel, he carved out footholds on lands he called discovered. But the people he encountered had lived there for millennia. The Taíno did not understand what was happening. Their hospitality was repaid with enslavement. Their traditions were mocked, outlawed, or obliterated. Whole families were rounded up. Men were sent to dig for gold, punished with mutilation if they failed quotas. Women were subjected to daily assault and servitude. Children, some no older than 5, were taken from their homes to serve in Spanish households. Epidemics, malnutrition, and despair spread faster than the galleons that brought them. Suicide became common among those who saw no future under bondage. Within 2 decades, the Taíno population had collapsed by over 90%. Communities that had thrived for generations were reduced to names on colonial records, and then erased entirely. Here's the truly disturbing part. It wasn't chaos, it was structure. The encomienda system, established under Isabella's reign, granted colonists the right to indigenous labor in exchange for Christian instruction. But in practice, it was slavery by another name. Laborers were branded, overseers were paid, and cruelty was rewarded. Reports sent back to Spain described the horrors in detail, and yet the Crown responded not with prohibition, but expansion, because the New World was now seen not as a mystery, but as a mine. A place where human lives were raw material, and land was merely a ledger of profit. The Taíno were among the first, but far from the last. The Caribbean became a crucible of violence, and the pattern repeated: welcome, betrayal, destruction. Villages were burned, sacred sites desecrated, entire languages lost in a single generation. This is what they don't want you to remember. The so-called discovery was genocide in slow motion. And Queen Isabella, though far away, was no distant monarch. She read the letters. She received the captives. She rewarded the conquerors. Her silence was not ignorance. It was approval. And her approval gave birth to an empire of annihilation. Textbooks still speak of the encounter as a cultural exchange. But what culture is exchanged at the tip of a sword? What learning occurs in chains? The truth is, the Taíno did not vanish. They were destroyed. Not by accident, not by misunderstanding, but by design. A design etched into policy, sealed with royal wax, and sanctified by theology. First contact was a test, and Europe failed. The Arawak peoples suffered similar fates. Enslaved, executed, exported. Their resistance was met with massacres. Their names faded as maps filled with new ones. San Juan, Santiago, Santa Maria. Names that honored saints, but buried sins. This is where the story turns. Because what began in the Caribbean became the model for the Americas. The scars of first contact are still visible in the silence of extinct languages, in the ruins swallowed by jungle, in the absence of old songs and old prayers. The apocalypse didn't arrive with fire from the sky. It came quietly, on wooden ships, bearing gifts and contracts. And it left behind silence where stories once flourished. The Taíno and Arawak nightmare is not a closed chapter. It is a blueprint, one used again and again, by kings, by corporations, by nations. And at its foundation stands a queen whose sainthood cloaks a legacy of silence and sorrow. So when we speak of 1492, we must speak also of the screams that followed. Because history, if honest, cannot flinch from first blood. And the first blood spilled was innocent. What if the age of exploration was also the age of enslavement, and they were never separate to begin with? By the end of the 15th century, the voyages Isabella financed had done more than map new worlds. They had commodified human life on a scale Europe had never seen. From the Caribbean to Castile, ships began ferrying a new kind of cargo, not spices or gold, but people. Indigenous bodies bound in chains. The earliest transatlantic slave routes were not established in Africa. They began with the conquest of the Americas. And Queen Isabella, often remembered as a patron of faith, was also a patron of this trade. She authorized it under the logic of just war and salvation. But in practice, it was industrialized dehumanization. Enslaved individuals were marched to ports, loaded onto ships like livestock, and dispersed throughout the Spanish Empire. The conditions were brutal. Starvation, disease, and exposure claimed many before they even reached shore. Others were sold into homes as domestic servants, laborers, or status symbols. The survivors lived in foreign lands, stripped of name, language, and lineage. Their memories were the last thing they owned, and even those were punished. The crown imposed legal codes that forbade native dress, native tongues, and native ceremonies. Rebellion, even spiritual, was met with lethal force. Entire generations were born in bondage. The fields of Hispaniola and Cuba became cemeteries of the living. Men were forced into mines, laboring until their lungs filled with dust and their bones gave way. Women were confined to homes they did not choose, their bodies conscripted for labor and violation. Children were baptized into servitude. And still, the documents from the Spanish court framed this as civilization. Isabella's directives made clear. Those who resisted were rebels against both crown and cross, and rebels deserved no mercy. This wasn't incidental, it was systematic. The early Spanish colonies functioned as testing grounds for coerced labor. The encomienda system assigned whole communities to individual colonists. In exchange for instruction in the faith, colonists received complete economic control. The truth, instruction was often a formality. Whips replaced scripture. Shackles replaced sermons. The crown reaped the rewards. Gold flowed into Castile. Tribute was measured not only in minerals, but in human breath. And when native populations began to collapse under the weight of this violence, discussions began, not about stopping it, but about supplementing it. This is where the Atlantic trade began to shift. From native bodies to African bodies. From accidental bondage to global enterprise. The infrastructure, routes, ports, paperwork was already in place. Isabella had built the skeleton. Her successors would give it flesh. But the ideological seed was hers. That certain peoples were destined to serve. That labor, forced and unpaid, was redemptive for the master, not the servant. That profit could be purified by prayer. Here's the disturbing truth. The early transatlantic slave trade did not emerge out of necessity. It emerged out of precedents. Precedents set by royal decree. And once it began, it was unstoppable. Within a century, millions would be enslaved. Some in the name of empire, others in the name of God, but always under banners first raised by Isabella. The narrative of discovery concealed a darker reality, a conveyor belt of broken lives. And the queen who commissioned the ships did not recall them when the bodies piled high. Today, the history books mention the Columbian Exchange. Crops, animals, cultures, but rarely does it mention the blood. The forced labor that built the ports, roads, and palaces. The sweat that irrigated the fields of empire, the cries that never made it into letters home. This is what isn't taught in school. The foundations of European wealth were human backs. The age of empire was not a chapter, it was a chain. And its first links were forged with Isabella's blessing. The Caribbean plantations, the silver mines of Mexico, the slave ships that crossed the Atlantic, all trace their lineage to this moment. When queen and court turned people into property, when theology became a ledger, and when conquest baptized slavery, the legacy lingers. In the economies built on unpaid labor, in the silences of museums and memorials, in the erased names of the first enslaved, they were not numbers. They were lives, counted, branded, traded, and their bondage began not with capture, but with command. A command signed by a queen still praised for her piety. But no amount of reverence can ransom the truth. The ships didn't just carry explorers, they carried chains, and the ocean still remembers. The 31st of March, 1492, Just weeks after Columbus embarked on his fabled voyage, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand issued a decree that would reshape the soul of Spain. It was not about exploration, economy, or national pride. It was about purity. The Alhambra decree declared that all practitioners of other religious faiths must convert or leave the realm entirely. No exceptions, no appeals. They were given until the 31st of July. 120 days to dismantle entire lives, to sell their homes, abandon their shops, leave behind graves and gardens and schools. To sever centuries of rooted existence overnight. Estimates suggest that between 40,000 and 100,000 people chose exile over betrayal of their beliefs. Those who stayed had to abandon their faith, language, books, and rituals. Those who left faced even crueler odds. Caravans were robbed, women were violated, ships were overloaded and sank, borderlands turned into ambushes. What Isabella called a cleansing was in reality a national trauma. It was not a migration, it was an exodus. But even more disturbing was the quiet theft hidden within the decree. Families were forced to sell everything at a loss. Homes worth gold were traded for scraps of bread. Businesses were seized by neighbors and crown loyalists. Libraries of philosophy, medicine, astronomy burned or confiscated. Cultural heritage turned into kindling for royal power. In many cases, children were forcibly taken and baptized. Marriages were dissolved by law. This wasn't about faith, it was about consolidation. The decree's text justified the act by alleging corruption and heresy. But the real heresy was the silence of the church. Silence that enabled one of the earliest state-orchestrated religious purges in modern Europe. Why does this decree matter today? Because it institutionalized the weaponization of identity. Because it taught future empires how to disguise ethnic cleansing as national security. Because it defined persecution not as horror, but as policy. For Isabella, the timing was strategic. With Granada conquered and the New World within reach, Spain was being reshaped. She envisioned a nation unified not by diversity, but by exclusion. The faithful who resisted were branded as enemies of state, no longer simply religious dissenters, but traitors to the crown. The fusion of religion and law, of church and crown, reached its apex in the Alhambra decree. This was not just about exile, it was about control. And through that control, Isabella crafted a dangerous myth. That purity equaled strength, that difference was weakness. That faith could be dictated by law. But this wasn't just a domestic agenda. The logic of the decree would cross oceans. It would inform colonial governance. It would appear again in conversion missions in the Americas. It would echo in the legal codes of future empires, all the way to modern nation-states. The haunting truth is that the Alhambra decree didn't die in 1492. Its spirit survives in every policy that targets belief. In every campaign that frames spiritual difference as a threat. In every regime that conflates identity with danger. Many of those exiled never returned. Their descendants scattered across continents. They built new lives, but never forgot the homeland that banished them. And yet, to this day, Isabella's image remains sanitized, cast in bronze, printed in textbooks, sanctified by the church. Rarely is she remembered as the architect of spiritual exile. Rarely is the decree read in full in classrooms. Rarely are the names of the exiled spoken aloud. But here's what they don't teach. The decree was not revoked until 1968. For nearly 5 centuries, its shadow lingered in Spanish law, a reminder that the machinery of persecution, once activated, is hard to dismantle. This is what isn't taught in school. That a queen praised for unity achieved it through destruction. That a document written in royal ink bled thousands into silence. That the first age of exploration was also an age of obliteration. And that beneath every flag waved in triumph, there lies a decree, unsigned by its victims. The Alhambra decree was more than policy, it was prophecy, a signal that the age of religious pluralism had ended and the age of enforced uniformity had begun. And in that silence, enforced by sword and decree, an entire civilization was unmade, not with fire alone, but with ink, not with war, but with a deadline. And the question echoes still: how many other decrees remain, invisible and unrevoked? After the Alhambra decree scattered families into exile, those who remained faced an even darker fate: forced conversion, not as an offer, but as an ultimatum. Baptism became the price of survival, and refusal meant imprisonment, torture, or death. In southern Spain, particularly Granada, the mask of diplomacy fell swiftly. In 1499, under Cardinal Cisneros, Isabella's trusted ally, conversion campaigns accelerated with terrifying speed. Entire neighborhoods were surrounded. Religious leaders were arrested or executed. Sacred texts, centuries-old manuscripts of philosophy, medicine, and poetry, were dragged into public squares and burned. Children were separated from families to be raised in Christian homes, and adults were baptized en masse, thousands in a single day, under armed supervision. This wasn't persuasion, it was policy backed by military threat. Converts were labeled new Christians, but suspicion followed them everywhere. A wrong word, a missed church service, or the whisper of old traditions could trigger inquisitorial arrest. It became dangerous to cook traditional meals, dangerous to speak ancestral languages, dangerous to pray at night. Even silence became incriminating. Isabella's government developed a new social category, the converso. A person marked not by belief, but by background. Even those who sincerely adopted Christianity were never fully trusted. They became targets of surveillance, slander, and scapegoating. The Inquisition set up elaborate networks of informants. Neighbors were encouraged to report on one another. Children betrayed parents. Spouses turned on each other under duress. A society once defined by multicultural exchange devolved into a theater of fear. People lived double lives, one for public display, another for private survival, and Isabella knew. She endorsed these tactics. She praised Cisneros's holy zeal. She approved the 1502 edict requiring all remaining non-Christians in Castile to convert. This expanded the scope of persecution across the entire kingdom. By law, to be Castilian was to be Christian, on paper, if not in heart. But here's the disturbing twist. Forced conversion did not end persecution. It prolonged it. It institutionalized a permanent underclass of suspects. Converted communities became convenient scapegoats for economic downturns and political unrest. And whenever the crown needed more land, more gold, or more fear, it turned to the Inquisition. All justified under the banner of orthodoxy. What was lost during this period cannot be calculated. Languages faded into oblivion. Sacred rituals disappeared. Oral histories were silenced. Families rewrote their pasts out of necessity. Memory itself became a liability. And yet, Isabella is still hailed as a patron of unity. But what kind of unity grows from the soil of betrayal? What kind of piety demands coercion? This is where the story turns. Because forced conversion wasn't just about religious conformity. It was a blueprint for future regimes. From colonial missions in the Americas to modern ideological purges, the methods, public confession, surveillance, mass re-education, would become eerily familiar. Inquisitors documented everything. Court transcripts survive detailing screams, pleas, and broken oaths. And in many cases, the same people were tried multiple times, converted, accused again, then punished anew. This wasn't salvation. It was spiritual colonization, a systematic erasure of difference, masked as divine mercy. And while Isabella never wielded the rack herself, she sanctioned its use. Her crown paid for its construction. Her silence blessed its violence. But here's the truly disturbing part. Many forced converts internalized their trauma. They taught their children not pride, but invisibility, not faith, but fear. Generations later, families still whisper stories of hidden identities, still carry surnames altered to escape detection, still light candles in secret, unsure whether it's heritage or heresy. That is the legacy of Spain's Holy Terror. Not just a loss of life, but a loss of lineage. Not just erased belief, but erased belonging. And it was all made possible by a queen canonized for her conviction. By the early 1500s, the landscape of Castile had changed. Gone were the vibrant enclaves of religious diversity. Gone were the markets where multiple tongues harmonized. Gone were the libraries curated by pluralistic minds. What remained was the illusion of unity, and behind that illusion stood Queen Isabella, architect of the purge. Her vision was not merely religious, it was ideological. It was the dream of a homogenized empire. One faith, one crown, one people. But achieving that meant eliminating everything that did not conform. Expulsions, inquisitions, forced conversions, these were not isolated incidents. They were parts of a coordinated campaign. A national purification strategy cloaked in divine rhetoric. And the result was not just silence, it was sterility. Cities once described as crossroads of civilizations became cultural monoliths. Entire professions disappeared as skilled artisans, physicians, and scholars were exiled or broken. The economy faltered, but the monarchy tightened its grip, because for Isabella, purity mattered more than prosperity. Her concept of cleansing extended to marriage laws, naming conventions, and bloodline investigations. The term limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, entered royal vocabulary. It codified exclusion into law. Ancestry became surveillance. Birthright became guilt. Even centuries later, a family's history could disqualify them from public office or church positions. This wasn't just about belief, it was about biology. And it laid the intellectual groundwork for future racial doctrines across Europe and its colonies. Here's what they don't want you to know. Isabella's regime invented an early form of ethno-nationalism. It weaponized religion to define who belonged and who could never belong. It established that power could be justified not by virtue, but by sameness. The effects were chilling. Religious minorities who had lived peacefully for generations became pariahs overnight. Their contributions to law, medicine, astronomy, and agriculture were erased from official memory. Churches were built atop former mosques and synagogues. Historical revision became a tool of control. School children were taught a purified version of Spanish history, one in which diversity was not erased. It had supposedly never existed. But the archives tell a different story. Letters of protest, eyewitness testimonies, secret genealogies, hidden documents smuggled out during exile. They speak of cities emptied overnight, of children baptized by force and taught to hate their ancestry, of royal proclamations celebrating spiritual victory while entire cultures lay in ruin. This is where the story deepens, because Isabella's ethno-religious vision didn't die with her. It became a model for colonial governance, for racial categorization, for nationalist policies centuries later. From the Americas to the Philippines, Spain exported this vision. in missionary schools, in plantation hierarchies, in the very maps drawn to divide civilized from savage, all traced back to the blueprint designed in Castile. But the cost was immeasurable. Spiritual extinction, cultural annihilation, psychological fragmentation. For the millions affected, survival meant erasing their own stories. And for those who refused, it meant death or disappearance. Yet somehow, Isabella remains canonized, her sainthood proposed by the same institution that once burned her victims alive. How does a queen who orchestrated one of Europe's earliest cultural purges become sanctified? The answer lies in power's ability to write history, and in society's comfort with forgetting. Because to remember, Isabella's real legacy is to confront the roots of Western imperial identity. It is to admit that empire was born not from glory, but from blood, not from unity, but from uniformity, enforced by sword and decree. The silence around this legacy is not accidental. It is maintained by institutions that continue to benefit from the order she built. Museums, universities, churches, monarchies. But memory, once awakened, cannot be silenced forever. And in reclaiming the stories she tried to erase, we strip away the last mask from the face of empire. The conquistadors are long gone, their swords rusted, their banners buried. But the systems they built, the ideologies they enforced, still cast long shadows. And Queen Isabella's fingerprints remain at the core. Her blueprint for domination was not buried with her. It metastasized across continents. Colonialism did not invent itself. It was drafted in Castile. The combination of religious justification, racial hierarchy, and economic exploitation, these were Isabella's gifts to empire. The forced conversions in Granada were mirrored in Mexico. The exiles of the Alhambra decree echoed in Andean resettlements. The encomienda system replicated itself in British, French, and Dutch colonies. But the template was Spanish, and the author was Isabella. Here's what they don't want you to know. When Portugal carved into Africa, when Britain chained children in India, when France re-educated Algeria, it was all déjà vu. Because these empires didn't invent colonial logic, they inherited it. The language of the civilizing mission, the notion that God willed conquest, the racial pseudoscience that followed, it all began in Isabella's court. Even the Vatican adopted her strategies, endorsing conquest as spiritual salvation. And the secular world followed. Railroads, plantations, prisons. These became the tools of new empires built on old principles. Principles born from Isabella's rule. Her vision demanded that difference be not merely distrusted, but dismantled. So difference became danger, and danger became justification for domination. This is what isn't taught in school. That progress was often a euphemism for cultural destruction. That development was a disguise for forced labor. That the modern world was not discovered, it was carved from the bones of older ones. And that carving began in 1492. In places like the Philippines, Spain used Isabella's model to merge military conquest with religious indoctrination. Churches replaced shrines, priests replaced elders. Names were changed, gods were erased. In Latin America, entire languages vanished within a generation. Educational systems were designed not to teach, but to erase. But wait, it gets worse. Even after independence movements threw off colonial rule, Isabella's legacy lingered. The elites that emerged mimicked their former masters. They preserved the hierarchies. They kept the schools, the laws, the land divisions. Post-colonial nations were often colonial in everything but name, because the idea that some people are born to rule and others to serve was never truly discarded. It was refined, reinvented, hidden beneath flags and anthems, but the bones remained. You can see it in how borders were drawn, straight lines that cut through tribes and histories. You can see it in how global trade still exploits the same regions Spain once plundered. You can see it in the names of cities, the shapes of parliaments, the hymns sung in state ceremonies. Isabella may be dead, but her vision lives. In every continent where her empire once touched, echoes remain. The ghosts of erased cultures whisper in museums. The songs of silenced tongues survive only in private rituals. And the wounds of conquest have not healed. They've been paved over. Ask the descendants of those once enslaved or exiled. Ask the communities still fighting to reclaim ancestral lands. Ask the children who grow up with no knowledge of their indigenous names. This isn't the past. This is the structure of the world we live in, a world whose foundations were poured under Isabella's gaze. The crowns may have changed, the flags may be different, but the logic remains. That domination is order. That uniformity is peace. That conquest is divine. And behind that logic is a queen canonized for her cruelty. Remember this. History is not just written by the victors, it is architected by them. Isabella wasn't simply a ruler. She was a designer of systems. Systems of silence, systems of control. And we, knowingly or not, still live inside her design. Queen Isabella died over 500 years ago, but her presence haunts more than history books. It lingers in the architecture of modern power, in the laws we write, in the institutions we trust, in the stories we refuse to question. This is the part that's hiding in plain sight. The blueprint she drafted still governs how societies think about order, loyalty, and identity. Surveillance is now digital, but the logic is old. Isabella's inquisitors once listened through keyholes. Today's governments monitor with algorithms. Yet the goal remains: ideological conformity. In her Spain, deviation was heresy. Today, it's unpatriotic. In her time, conversion was coerced through ritual and force. Today, it's masked in bureaucracy and cultural assimilation. But wait, it gets worse. The same methods used to purge spiritual difference are now deployed to control dissent. Schools standardize what can be known. News cycles dictate what can be said. Social platforms reward silence and punish memory. But the model isn't new. It's Isabella's, repackaged for modern governance. Even immigration policy bears her mark. She once defined belonging by belief. Today, it's defined by documents, oaths, and biometric scans. Then it was inquisitors, now it's border agents. But the message is unchanged: conform or be cast out. And here's the truly disturbing part. Even mass media reveres her. Documentaries call her visionary. Scholars debate her legacy in hushed, careful tones. Museums display her artifacts as treasures, not tools of suppression. Universities name buildings after her allies. The Vatican still flirts with her sainthood. The erasure continues, not just of her victims, but of the systems she created. Those systems now wear liberal masks. They preach tolerance while practicing exclusion. They claim progress while enforcing obedience. They teach about exploration while skipping genocide. The textbook sanitizes what the archives scream. Her name becomes trivia, not testimony. But the evidence is everywhere. Look at colonial-era statues in city squares. Look at the laws written in the wake of conquest. Look at the wealth of Western capitals, accumulated through centuries of exploitation rooted in Isabella's doctrines. Still think her story is over? Still believe the past is past? Her methods live in police states, in economic hierarchies, in propaganda that calls suppression unity. And still, her defenders say she brought order. But order for whom? And at what cost? The empires she inspired still extract from the global south, still install regimes that mimic her ruthlessness, still train leaders to consolidate through fear. It's not medieval, it's modern, and it's endorsed, funded, and exported. That's the legacy hidden in plain sight. The real question isn't what Isabella did. It's why we're still doing it. Why we still reward systems born from her cruelty. Why we still cloak conquest in virtue. Why erasure is easier than remembrance. The truth isn't buried. It's just inconvenient. Because to recognize Isabella as an architect of empire is to admit that our world is not post-colonial, it's neo-colonial. That our freedoms rest on foundations of silence. That our peace is purchased by forgetting. And that progress without truth is just a polished repetition of the past. Her blueprint is intact, her influence is alive, her memory is manipulated, and unless we confront that, honestly, directly, and without flinching, we remain the subjects of her design. Queen Isabella died in the year 1504, but her dream did not. It metastasized, quietly, globally, enduringly. Her children are not defined by bloodline. They are defined by ideology. They are presidents and priests, billionaires and bureaucrats. They do not wear crowns, but they rule. And their world mirrors hers, a world where difference is dangerous, where conformity is rewarded, where empire is not named, but enforced. This is the part they never teach you, that the modern global order is not a break from Isabella's reign. It is its fulfillment. Consider the architecture of control today. Surveillance normalized, borders militarized, economies rigged to benefit the elite few. These are not accidents, they are inheritances. The Inquisition has become intelligence agencies. Her censorship lives in algorithms. Her conversion campaigns echo in nation-building abroad. Her colonial logic guides foreign policy. And her ethno-religious ideals echo in immigration laws. But wait, it gets darker. Isabella's model of domination is now cloaked in the language of progress. Hollywood sells it as heroism. Institutions call it democracy. Schools present it as history's natural arc. But beneath the surface, it's the same ancient machinery, the same scripts, the same exclusions. We are living in the empire she imagined, where morality is manipulated by the powerful, where virtue is used to justify violence, where elites claim divine purpose as they fracture societies. This isn't hyperbole, it's structure. Consider global debt chains. Who profits? Who pays? Consider refugee crises. Who closes the gates? Who built the walls? Consider cultural collapse. Broken homes, lost traditions, mental illness. These are not unfortunate trends. They are symptoms, designed outcomes of a system that began in Isabella's court, where the family was redefined as property, where belief became a weapon, where identity was legislated into obedience. And now, in boardrooms and palaces, her descendants operate without her name, quiet, calculated, cloaked in benevolence. They control narratives through media. They manipulate economies through speculation. They shape values through entertainment. And here's the truly disturbing part. The moral language she used, of salvation, of purification, of righteousness, still cloaks global policy. We call it intervention, peacekeeping, security. But the tools are the same: coercion, conversion, control, Isabella's spirit lives not in statues but in systems. And those who uphold these systems are her ideological heirs. They've simply exchanged robes for suits, altars for stock markets, edicts for algorithms. But the cruelty remains calibrated, the silence remains institutionalized, the deception remains polished, and through it all, we are taught to forget, taught to venerate her, taught to call conquest civilization. But if we name her truly, we name the system we live in. And that is where the reckoning begins. History is not written by the victors, it is rewritten by them. And no one understood this better than Queen Isabella I of Castile. Her legacy, canonized in cathedrals and carved into curricula, wears the mask of virtue. But behind that gilded mask lies something older, colder, an architecture of control, not just over lands or laws, but over memory itself. She is praised as La Católica, the Catholic monarch, but this title was not earned by grace. It was cemented in blood. Under her rule, extermination became administration, enslavement became commerce, and the gospel became a sword. Isabella did not simply adapt to the violence of her time. She engineered it, designed it, exported it. What she pioneered in the Canary Islands, she perfected in Granada. What she endorsed in Columbus, she institutionalized through Inquisition. And what she demanded of her subjects, obedience, uniformity, silence, she still demands of us. Because her ghost is not interred in a royal tomb. It walks the corridors of law. It echoes in political speeches. It blinks from biometric scanners and border walls. It smirks in schoolbooks that call her bold, faithful, visionary. But here's what those schoolbooks won't tell you. That thousands of Guanche women were raped into silence. That Taíno children were worked to death before reaching puberty. That entire libraries of philosophy, theology, medicine were burned as heresy. That she seized gold with one hand and pressed the crucifix with the other. And still, she is called saint. Still, statues of her rise above plazas she helped pave with bones. Still, her name blesses scholarships, cathedrals, naval vessels. So we must ask, when the saints are the butchers, what happens to the faith? When empire wears a halo, how do we tell holiness from horror? The answer lies not in her monuments, but in her mechanisms. Control through fear, unity through erasure, piety as performance, and conquest as destiny. This is why remembering her truth is not just historical housekeeping, it's resistance. Because forgetting her is how her system survives. And remembering her, as she truly was, is how it begins to fall apart. Not with violence, but with clarity. Not with vengeance, but with witness. We cannot undo what she built, but we can refuse to live beneath its shadow. We can question the histories we inherit. We can name the unnamed. We can speak where silence was once enforced, and in doing so, we do what Isabella feared most. We remember, not her myth, but her victims, not her glory, but the grief she imposed. And if we teach this, if we tell it plain, without apology, then her sainthood becomes what it always should have been, a warning, not a celebration, a mirror, not a mantle. Because in the end, it was not the sword that made her powerful, it was the silence. And silence, at last, is no longer an option.